大家好. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here at National Taiwan University. My father went here as an undergraduate. So those of you who are students, you're in good company, at least from my perspective. And my uncle's a professor here for many, many years. My uncle here, no, he's not. That's fine. I didn't think he was. I think he's moved on. He's a dean now. But because of that, this is kind of the family school for me. Next to potentially UC Berkeley, which is where my dad went to graduate school and met my mom. And then they got married and had my brother, who's named after the Lawrence Hall of Science at UC Berkeley. Anyone who's into Berkeley. Anyway, so it's either National Taiwan University or UC Berkeley is the Yang family school. Oh, good. I've seen so many pictures of myself. I was like, oh, what did they choose? By the way, I did not entitle this presentation myself. This What Went Wrong with Democracy in America. Though I will totally own it. I mean, it's pretty accurate. But I was like, oh, look at that. It's a fine choice. I'm super excited to be here. I visited Taiwan last in December of 2017. And I sat down with my aunts and uncles and cousins, and I said to them, when I go back to the US, I'm going to run for president. And they did not really understand what I was saying. And so one of them said, like, that seems very exciting. And I said, yeah, it will be exciting. And I came back to visit in December of 2017, in part because I thought that I'd have a hard time visiting Taiwan after I became a presidential candidate. I thought I'd be busy. And then COVID happened, and so this has been my first chance to visit since then. But it's great to be back. As was shared, my parents live here in Taiwan, and my father and one of my sons had barely met before this week. So hopefully they had a connection and bond. Now, I have a deck here that has a bunch of big themes, but I do want to reflect a little bit on what brought me to this, where my parents brought up my brother and I with a few very simple messages, which were get good grades, go to a good school, get a good job, try and make your way in American society. You know what they did not say to me when I was a child? You're going to run for office one day, or you're going to be president of the United States. Like, that was not the message in the Yang household. It was, I think my father's turn of phrase was, try not to be a burden on society. So as a result, I was, I think, very similar to many of the folks you know. And here in this stanza, I had started a nonprofit that was described Venture for America. Here's me with President Obama. So my family was excited about me for this week. What we did is we went around the country helping startups and entrepreneurs grow their businesses in Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, St. Louis, New Orleans, Birmingham, a bunch of American cities most of you have probably not been to, I'm guessing. How many of you all have family in America? Let's try that. All right, and most of them, I'm going to guess, live on one of the coasts, probably California, New York, a bit of Texas. I think that's about right. So I had not been to Ohio, Missouri, Wisconsin, Michigan, Louisiana, Alabama, until I started this organization, Venture for America, which I ran from 2011 to 2017. So I was the wholesome entrepreneur, business guy, honored by the White House a couple of times. I actually got to bring my wife, Evelyn, to meet President Obama. So that was a lot of fun. He amused himself by impressing my wife. It's a very true story. He was like, hello, nice to meet you. It was his amusement of the day. All right, so this was me until Trump wins in 2016, and then I run for president, which is many of you had heard of me. So this is me during the presidential campaign. I started out as an anonymity and then eventually raised $40 million from hundreds of thousands of Americans, made 7 presidential debates, outcompeted about a dozen members of Congress, governors, cabinet secretaries, et cetera, et cetera. And I was running on a message around the American economy and how it had transformed. And visiting the Midwest and the South of the country, I thought I had a sense as to why things had changed. So technology was starting to transform America's economy in different ways. that were affecting the Midwest and the South in particular. So these are the top 5 job categories in the United States of America. Give you a sense of it. What percentage of Americans do you think graduate from college? I heard 20, 30, and 40. Those are all in the ballpark. The real number is 35%. So when you think about an economy, it's 2/3 high school graduates. So what do high school graduates do for a living? They do administrative and clerical, which includes call centers, pick up the phone and do customer service, retail, food service and food prep, truck driving and transportation, manufacturing still. And so these 5 job categories comprise what percentage of all American jobs, do you think? It's about half, 49%. And as you can see, most of these jobs are filled by high school graduates. And if you think about it for a bit, you realize also that most of these job categories are going to shrink significantly in the years to come. So here we had this picture of, whoops, so this is a manufacturing plant that's mostly robots now. But according to Bain, you're looking at a labor displacement rate of several times that of the Industrial Revolution around the turn of the century, which people think about as like the big transition. So this transformation is going to affect, according to the Obama White House, 83% of the jobs where people make less than 20 bucks an hour. And the average American makes $17 an hour. So if you talk about 83% of the jobs that make less than 20%, less than $20, it's pretty much 83% of 80% of the jobs or something like that. It's a very, very significant percentage. So this is why I decided to run, is that when Trump won the presidency in 2016, I thought, okay, America is going through this incredible economic transformation, and for whatever reason, it doesn't understand what's happening to it. So I'm going to help us understand and advance meaningful solutions. Now, I'm going to confide in you all, I did not expect to win. I did not think I was going to be president of the United States. I was not heartbroken not to be president of the United States. I don't really, I didn't have some burning desire to, I had a burning desire to try and help my country understand what the heck was happening to it. And I saw Trump as the symptom or the manifestation of a worsening disease. And I said, okay, if I can help America understand the disease, then we can talk about cures, and then we have a chance. And if I succeed in that, then I will have succeeded. That was my attitude. Now, this transforming economy is going to affect white-collar workers as well as blue-collar workers, where some of the easiest to automate jobs are repetitive cognitive jobs, which includes things like accountants, traders, lawyers, journalists now. How many of you have played with the ChatGPT software, the AI bot? And then you start thinking, okay, what could you use this for? You could definitely use it to write basic summaries of news items, which is increasingly automated, or maybe sporting events recaps. And so you're going to eat a lot more of these white-collar jobs as well as blue-collar jobs progressively. 44% of American jobs are in either repetitive manual or repetitive cognitive. And so both of those segments are going to shrink significantly. So this is the manufacturing sector, which to me is the biggest emblem. So it goes from 17 million, give or take, to 12 million between 2000 and today, more or less. And that dip of 4 to 5 million jobs took place primarily in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, the Midwestern states that Trump won in 2016. And one of the trends you're seeing in the United States, if you're, I'm sorry to give you all this US geography quiz, but so that there are a number of states in the Midwest that used to be swing states in America: Ohio, Missouri, Iowa, all states that Obama won, as an example. All 3 of those states have now gone Republican by 8 or 9 points: Ohio, Missouri, Iowa, where they're no longer considered swing states. And a lot of that is because of this, because those states were where a lot of these manufacturing jobs were. And if you look at a voting district, when you get rid of the jobs, it goes from blue or purple to red. Everyone becomes conservative when you take their jobs away, turns out. So this is what drove Trump to the White House, in my opinion, and by the way, that's borne out by the data. And then, unfortunately, it ended up driving Americans into very negative circumstances, where this blue line is non-Hispanic whites in the US essentially killing themselves via drugs, alcohol, or suicide between the ages of 50 and 54. And you can see it's an outlier in the world. The other industrialized countries you think of as peers, the United States, Canada is represented with one line, pretty flat. Australia, a little bit. France, so it's like pretty much, the US is the one that sticks out, right? By the way, this trend has gotten a lot worse since this graph was drawn. The American life expectancy, including COVID, which has obviously had a huge impact, now has the same life expectancy it did in 1996. So it's done away with a generation's worth of progress. It is genuinely going backwards by the most fundamental measurement, which is just how long people live. So this is all, and you can see this trend started kicking off what year? Around 2000, turn of the century, which is, again, the same time that this happened. You see how that connection is? If I get rid of 4 or 5 million manufacturing jobs that were held by Midwestern whites, they start killing themselves. And they go home and have very negative social outcomes. Now, one of the outgrowths of this is that the percentage of American children born to an unmarried mother is now 41%. So almost half of American kids are born to a single mom. And if you look at the data, this is particularly bad for young boys, because 85% of single parents are single mothers, and little boys are more sensitive to the absence of a father than little girls, especially if they're single parents, the mom. Because if you're a girl, you have a strong female role model, you're good at school, things work out okay. If you're a little boy, there's no role model, you have academic problems, behavioral problems. This is happening throughout the US in a very significant way. And when does that curve spike again? Around 2000, right? Like you get rid of 4 to 5 million manufacturing jobs, and then American families stop forming. If you don't have a college degree in the United States, the odds of you getting married are now below 50%. So I'm going to suggest that's like a pretty basic sign of prosperity or optimism. It's like if you wake up and you think you're going to get married at some point. Now that's a reality for less than half of Americans who don't graduate from college. So on top of this has been massive cost increases for 3 principal items: housing, healthcare, and education, which are represented by those lines going off to the right. During this time, earnings have not kept pace. Earnings are represented by the pale gray line, and healthcare and education have gone up and up in cost. I have 2 young kids who are 10 and 7, and college will be approximately 250% more expensive than when I went. And one joke I tell is, has college gotten 2.5 times better? Probably not, but it has gotten 2.5 times more expensive. So these are the reasons why Americans seem to be crazier and crazier, is that you're making a lot of the basic paths to a middle-class life more and more difficult and out of reach, and they're freaking out more and more. I don't know, this talk, What Went Wrong with American Democracy? It's a pretty good title, actually. So these are America's global rankings and various basics. I don't know where Taiwan is on these, but the summation is that America is now 31st in the world and declining in quality of life measurements, such as life expectancy at 60, child mortality, access to drinking water, quality education, et cetera, et cetera. So we're 31st and going down. I don't know if people think about this. So my parents immigrated to the US in the 60s from Taiwan, and they went there for a better opportunity for me and my brother. And I'm super grateful. That deal worked out phenomenally well. I love America. But that deal is now very shaky. You know, there are more and more people that, if they have a choice between America and someplace else, are choosing someplace else, increasingly, for a whole host of reasons. And these are the numbers behind that. I don't know what people think about America and Taiwan in this light. I guess from the intros, it sounds like this is on people's minds. So why does it feel like American democracy is falling apart? I went through the backdrop of the economy and families and various things. And so why is it that the American political system has not tried to address any of these problems in any major way, right? I mean, if you look at this, you think like, wait, isn't America democracy? Like, wouldn't people get mad and then political leaders would do something about it? Did anyone here think that? No. So I know Taiwan essentially has a two-party system, though every once in a while a third party does something cool. I think one of them won a mayoral race here quite recently. I actually met with a leader of this third party in the US, and he was a literal rock star. Do you all know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about? He was like the lead singer of a heavy metal band or something. And he was cool. He was cool. He had tattoos and cool hair and good energy. Anyway, so you all have a two-party system, and you might have different feelings about how well it functions here in Taiwan. But I'm going to suggest to you that the United States is, gosh, maybe like 15 times bigger than Taiwan in terms of population. It's like 330 million, very vast area. So having a two-party system between urban and rural gets more and more irrational the larger and more diverse your country is, which is the case in the US. So why does it feel like America's falling apart? This is the US approval of Congress rate. In other words, the percentage of Americans that like what's happening out of their representatives. And you can see it used to be higher. That spike was the first Gulf War, when everyone's like, USA, like go get them. You know, that was like the, like 9/11. And then now it's around 22%. So 4 out of 5 or 3 out of 4 Americans are unhappy with Congress. What is that number here in Taiwan? What's your government's approval rate? Is that touchy? All right, well, I'm going to suggest it's pretty hard to do worse than 22%. So 22% of Americans are, what's that? What is it here? Anyway, so it's 22% or so in the US, which is pretty low. I don't think most businesses would survive with a 22% approval rate. And yet the rate at which members of Congress get reelected is above 90%. It's actually 94%. 92% is a little low. So if you look at that difference, you look at it and say, wow, like how does that happen? How can 3 out of 4 Americans be unhappy, yet everyone in Congress wins, more or less? Right? So there are some structural reasons why these numbers are the way they are. The main reason is that 83, and that's low, it's more like 85 to 90% of congressional seats are uncontested in the general election. They're either Democratic or Republican. So let's say your family members live in California. The odds are in most of California they're represented by Democrats, and there's zero uncertainty around that. It's going to be a Democrat. To the extent that there is any competitiveness, it's not between the parties, it's within the party at the primary level. So the 10% number here is the percentage of Americans who vote in a party primary. So what's happened is that the two parties have divided the United States into territories where Democrats dominate in coastal and urban areas and Republicans dominate in rural and interior areas. And they don't even really try very hard in the other person's territory. So, by the way, they both like to draw the lines so that their districts are safe. So you have 85 to 90% of the races will be non-competitive in the general. So the only way I can lose is if I lose within my party, which means that my job is not to make 51% of Americans happy or to solve any of these problems. My job is to just keep the 10% on the extreme flank of the left or the right happy, and then I win forever. So that is the structural set of incentives that why Americans seem like they're kind of on this side or that side. And then media organizations in the US make it worse because they separate people into tribes based upon what they watch. And then social media pours gasoline on the whole thing by rewarding people's inflammatory argumentativeness, attacks, like aggressiveness. And so you wind up with these two poles that don't represent most of the country and don't have any interest in solving any of the underlying structural problems. And these forces that are driving people to the side are getting stronger, not weaker. If you look at the numbers, you see that the folks who used to be somewhere in the middle are shrinking quickly in both parties. So now if you are in office, your job is just to avoid getting primaried, and then the general election is a formality. Because of the way the two parties have divvied up the country. I don't know if does Taiwan, how does it work here? Like, are the districts competitive? Are there places where, I get the sense that they're pretty competitive, because I've seen like the mayoralties flip. So it doesn't really flip in the US. Like, there will not be a Republican mayor of San Francisco. It just will not happen. You know what I mean? Or Los Angeles. Essentially, a Republican tried to run for mayor of Los Angeles this past cycle, and what did he do? He switched to a Democrat immediately beforehand, and then he spent $100 million, and he lost. So in America, there's a lack of real competition between the parties. So this is a very scary picture. So you just need the extreme 10% to like you to win your election, and then you're fine. Now, these problems are asymmetrical. The Republican Party has a bigger problem with the nature of its extremists, and about 80% of the extremist violence in America comes from the right, comes from the far right, statistically. There are about 300 militias in the US, and about 80% of them are on the far right. There are some splinter groups on the left, but it's not. So on the left, there are other distortions that are taking place that are problematic but not symmetrical. So over time, the system will make crazy people reasonable, and then the reasonable crazy, which I'm going to suggest is sort of a, not a great political environment for Taiwanese Americans or Asian Americans generally, because I think that Asian Americans are less likely to be ideologically extreme and more likely to be kind of pragmatic and data-driven and results-oriented and trying to work with other people. So, this polarization has billions of dollars behind it. I am a contributor sometimes for CNN, and CNN is trying now to be less Democratic aligned, but the fact is most viewers of the networks know what message they're going to get. If you're watching Fox, you're going to get the Fox message. If you're watching MSNBC, you're going to get the MSNBC message. And if you're watching CNN, you want whatever the CNN message is, and then if CNN deviates from that message, your ratings go down, not up. So that's the bind that a lot of these companies are in. 60,000 US journalists have lost their jobs over the last 10 years, primarily at local newspapers that have essentially disappeared in the US. So there used to be local papers that would cover things up the middle, and now they don't exist. So they've gotten replaced by Fox and MSNBC and Facebook feeds. So you see the business models then end up fueling it in various ways. And who trusts the media now is based upon which party you support. So 69% of Democrats have a high trust in media. Republicans is down to 15%. So one of the big issues here is that there's an erosion of institutional trust in America, where the average American thinks that the leaders, the people on TV are untrustworthy. And if you're a Republican, then your trust is like so low, it's almost unfathomable. And by the way, now the majority of Republicans are high school graduates. So if you can imagine a white high school graduate in America whose way of life has been getting worse and worse over the last number of years, you just don't trust anything anyone's telling you. And you saw this in part happen with COVID and the vaccines, which I don't know if you all were keeping up with the state's discussion on that. But virtually everyone in the media was like, hey, you got to get vaccinated. And then there was like this whole splintering group of conservatives being like, no, vaccines are bad. And this is supported then by the social media ecosystem, because there are YouTube influencers that like have the COVID vaccines are bad message, and then they have a place to go. So partisanship is the new acceptable form of prejudice, said one Democratic commentator, Ezra Klein, who wrote a book, Why We're Polarized, on this subject. And now about half of Americans consider themselves independent, but they are unrepresented in the American political system, because the American political system is wholly controlled by both Democrats and Republicans, even though now only about 25% of Americans say that they belong to either party. So you have a real set of structural problems in the states in terms of the Democratic representation. So what am I trying to do now to fix things? Is that the way out of this is to try and get rid of the party primaries that disproportionately empower the extremes in America. Now, the way the American voting system is set up is that there is nothing in the US Constitution about political parties. The founding fathers of America actually hated political parties. George Washington warned against them, said that let's not have parties. John Adams, the next president, said 2 parties would be a great evil across the land. James Madison said that the problem is factions that don't shift and just clash and clash. So the way out of this mess is to get rid of the party primaries in the United States of America. That sounds very difficult, but all of these systems are controlled at the state level in the United States. Again, there's nothing in the US Constitution about any of this. All of this sort of got adopted by the 2 parties who divvied up the country, and this system came into being essentially in 1860 or so. It's about 160 years old. So I looked at this data in 2020. Here's my story. I decided to run for president in 2017. I ran between 2018 and 2020. I come off the trail, and people were excited about me when I came off the trail, because my campaign had achieved more than most people thought it would. But I still felt terrible about the future of America. You know, like I was, you know, moderately well known and on TV, and I still felt very despondent about the direction of American politics. So I tried to figure out why I felt so bad, and then I figured out the structures are deeply flawed and will lead to bad outcomes and increased polarization and conflict in American life. Now, being someone who is positive and wants to solve problems, I set about trying to figure out, okay, how do you get out of this mess if you're America? And the way out is to get rid of the party primaries, which is doable because one state has already done it in America. That state's Alaska. They did away with the party primaries in 2020. And as a result, Sarah Palin, who you probably know from the SNL sketches and other things, lost because you got rid of the party primary, and Lisa Murkowski, who voted to impeach Trump, won because you got rid of the party primaries. So the hope in America is to go around the country and get rid of party primaries as quickly as you can. Now, the cost of the Alaska ballot initiative that got rid of the party primaries was $6 million US, which is very cheap because Alaska is very cheap. And then in Nevada, a ballot initiative passed to get rid of the party primaries this past November, so last month, and that cost $17 million. There are 24 other states that have these ballot initiatives, so you're looking at spending approximately $300 million US to try and get rid of the party primaries with a success rate of approximately 50%. So this is what I realized was the way out for the United States of America, is to say, look, the parties are distorting everything and making it so that what happens to the American people is irrelevant to the people in power. So what you have to do is get rid of the party primaries, raise a popular movement, raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and go around saying, look, let's just get rid of these party primaries, and then we'll have a chance for a brighter future. Now, I decided to do that because I'm still here, and my kids are growing up in the United States, and I'm now in the top level of Americans who might be able to solve this set of problems. Interestingly, there are very few Americans who even understand these problems and want to solve them, because the entire media constellation is on one team or the other. And so if you go to them and say, hey, the problem is the teams, they don't want to report on that, because their business model is built around being on one team or the other. So that is what I've been doing now for the past 14 months. And the Forward Party, which I started last year, is now the third biggest political party by resources in the United States. Now that's a very low bar, because it goes something like 1, 2, and then you got to go all the way down here to 3, which is where Forward is. So we raised approximately, I don't know, maybe 8 million US or something like that. So it's, you know, like a reasonable start in a year. And we're going around trying to take shots at the American political system to open it up so that you have genuine representation and competition. What do you all think? And I'm going to suggest that our success in this endeavor has profound effects on the people here in Taiwan, because if you look at the American leadership system, you're like, wait, I don't know what the heck's going on with the American leadership system. It has profound effects for democracies around the world. And so there's a very high stakes challenge that we're undertaking, and we don't have unlimited time, because I don't think America's democracy is built to last over a multi-decade period at this point. You're seeing failures right and left. And this current system is very, very vulnerable to bad leadership and authoritarianism, which you saw with Donald Trump. So you have Donald Trump arrive, and everyone's like, oh, Trump bad, and then he wins, and then what did you hear? Trump good, from anyone who's a Republican. And then if you say Trump not good, it'd be like, well, it's better than the Democrats, and so then everyone falls behind. You're going to see Joe Biden declare for re-election next year in 2023. He will be 82 years old in 2024. You're going to see the Democratic Party of the US just fall in behind him. Say, Joe Biden great? Now, a lot of the independents in the middle will be like, look, Joe Biden was great, but now he's getting kind of old. And then that line of reasoning will get completely shouted down by the media, like in that camp. And you'll see dozens and dozens of Democrats just endorse Joe and say, you know, like, because there is a very powerful set of incentives to stay in line with your party. You saw it with Trump. You'll see it when Joe declares. You'll see it over and over again. So the American political system is badly in need of an injection of dynamism through an adjustment to their primary system. So I talked about how she lost. It's a good picture of her. So the Forward Party's message is around unity and humanity, where we're saying, look, don't choose sides against each other. Like, let's come together for the common good. I can disagree with you and still like and admire you. We're still on the same team. And this is particularly vital for Asian Americans in the US, in part because Asian Americans right now are caught in the middle. They don't see themselves represented fully by either side. They're gravitating more towards Democrats because this version of the Republican Party seems unwelcoming and harsh and somewhat xenophobic. But they also don't know that the Democratic Party does not prioritize Asian Americans. And one of my pitches to Asian Americans is, look, the two-party system will always sideline Asian Americans by the numbers. You are 6.5% of the population. We tend to be concentrated in certain states. And we're just lower on the hierarchy than other groups. And they're not going to want that to change. The best way forward for Asian Americans is to try and introduce a more dynamic system where having a group of voters in the middle actually can affect outcomes instead of having to be within one of the parties and then suppressed and silenced very consistently. So I'm incredibly excited about this message reaching Taiwanese Americans and Asian Americans in this coming year, the early adopters of the Forward Party have been moderate white Republicans who are uncomfortable with the direction of the Republican Party. But we are expanding quickly, and we think that this coming year is going to be the year that we really introduce ourselves to the Asian American community in many ways. And these are examples of some of the people that are getting together. We have chapters in all 50 US states, state leads in 46 of them, and a lot of exciting developments upcoming. So that is my deck. I think I've pretty much explained what went wrong with democracy in America. And I'm thrilled to take questions from you all. Thank you so much.
First of all, thank you very much for this very, very informative talk. And especially, we just realized you're taking your personal and private time to share with us. Okay, I love to hear that the American democracy is in a mess, because it always makes me feel better about Taiwan then. You have lectured so profoundly about the problems domestic, the US. I would like to to shift the focus a little bit to hear what you say about the US foreign policy a little bit. I think you have given maybe thousands of lectures in the past 3 years, but this lecture today is probably one of the very special ones for you as well. First of all, it's your parents' home. And secondly, you are actually talking to people who are living on these islands, which have been labeled as one of the most dangerous places on the earth. And every time I heard the expression that Taiwan is the canary in the coal mine, I find it very creepy, because the canary in the coal mine is the bird which dies to warn other people to run. And who wants to be the canary in the coal mine? And so my question for you is, we know that Trump put US first, and Biden actually pretty much followed the policy vis-a-vis China, that is containment and hardcore competition rather than dialogue, which happens to be the kind of policy for Taiwan, the ruling party of Taiwan at this moment as well. So my question for you is, when you consider the situation here across the strait, do you support this policy that's going on right now by the US, meaning that containment and hardcore competition rather than dialogue?
Oh, thank you for the thoughtful question. It's been on my mind for a long time, as it has been I know for many of you. There are two things I'd say. Number one is that I think that America's foreign relations have been called into question by the political dysfunction, in part because you think that if one party wins the race, then you have a different operating stance than if the other party wins the race, which reduces your reliability. But if there is one thing that the two parties seem to agree on right now, it's trying to contest who can be, quote unquote, tougher on China. And as someone who lives in America, I've taken the perspective that that's an unhealthy competition. It will lead in directions that will antagonize China. And as someone who considers myself something of a humanist, if you have the US and China in a Cold War or worse, it's very, very bad for humanity. It's bad for the world. It will make cooperating on climate change or AI or anything else much less likely. And I also believe that the reason why they're competing on who can be tougher on China is in part because Asian Americans don't have a meaningful political voice in America, so that if there's going to be one group you can kind of, like ignore. I think Asian Americans are pretty high on the list to be ignored. And so when I talk to Taiwanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans in the US, there's a deep discomfort because they feel like if China is continuously cast as the villain then a lot of Americans don't distinguish that powerfully between Chinese and Chinese Americans and Asian Americans and Taiwanese Americans. And that we are the group that you can ignore and push around, and even in some cases physically assault, and nothing bad happens to you. So to the extent that I personally have an outlook, it's that the US and China are the two most important countries in the world, and them competing is natural. But having that competition reach aggression or mistrust or Cold War or worse, I think is just bad for us all. And I don't know how that comports with the current Taiwanese government's operating approach. And it could be maybe my nature, but my nature is to try and manage tension and reduce conflict rather than elevate it.
Thank you. 那我们有第二题是阳明山未来学社叶匡时理事长提问。
After listening your talk, I now think that your forward parties are trying to save Americans' democracy, right? However, we look at history of American politics. There's hardly any place for a third party besides the Democrat and the Republican. Why you think you will succeed this time, and what gives you the reason for you to think that way?
The Republican Party was itself the third party when it won the presidency in 1860. It's a long time ago, I know. But they won with 39% of the vote in a multi-candidate race. Before that, it was the Democrats, and you're not going to believe this, it was the Whigs and the Know-Nothings. And the Republican Party got its start in 1854 and then won the White House 6 years later in 1860. The Republicans and Democrats were then kind of similar to each other for about 100 years. I jokingly called them vanilla versus French vanilla, where they didn't have sharp ideological differences. You certainly didn't care if your child dated or married someone of the other party. Like they were not that much at odds. That shifted in 1964 when the US passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which then flipped the South from Democrat to Republican, and then started this migration where the Democratic Party became more and more the party of the coasts and the urban and the educated, and Republicans became more the party of the white and the less educated and the rural. And you can see the steps throughout the years where the Fairness Doctrine was repealed in 1987, which held that you had to present both sides of an issue on TV. So if you watch old-timey American TV, there are two people talking, you remember that? And then they got rid of that in 1987. Then in 1992, Fox and MSNBC were founded. 2004, Facebook came online. And if you look at the numbers, the polarization in US counties just picked up with each cycle. So this state of American democracy is essentially unique in American history and the world, in that there's not a common set of democracies that have found themselves in these circumstances. Now, if you say project forward in the US, I'd actually submit to you all, do you think it's more likely that the two-party system stays the same over the intervening 30, 40 years? Or is it likely to undergo some kind of change? And I'm going to suggest it's going to undergo some sort of change, with the most likely change being very, very negative. The most likely change is that one of the parties gets corrupted by very, very demagogic, terrible leadership, and then takes power, and you have this very strange, authoritarian, neo-fascist regime in the US. That's the most likely outcome, genuinely, not to scare you. And some people will regard that government as like not authoritarian, others will. I mean, in America, at this point, everything gets politicized. So that's the most likely outcome. The other outcome is that it evolves and advances into something more multi-party and dynamic and representative, which is the hope that we're holding out with the forward parties to say, look, your problem is that your incentives have been captured by the folks on this side or that side in the media. And so we have to do away with these structures and then reconnect the population of the US and its representatives and make it so that there's like more genuine accountability and representativeness. It's a very tall order, but if you look at the numbers, about half of Americans now don't think either party represents them, and 62% of Americans say they want a third party. This is where it gets interesting, that they know the current system does not work. So if you were an entrepreneur or business person, and I said there's a multi-billion-dollar marketplace, there are 2 providers, and 62% want a third provider, you would start a provider, right? So you start this provider, and then you have a whole host of hurdles to overcome. You have to try and get through the rules and regulations at each of the 50 states. You have to build your own media apparatus. You have to get your own donor network. You have to rebuild the billion-dollar infrastructures of each of the major parties. It's a mammoth challenge, but I'm going to suggest to you that let's say you wound up with a Donald Trump-Joe Biden rematch in 2024 as one possibility, which, by the way, is still a very distinct possibility. And I'm going to go through the numbers a little bit. I talked about Joe Biden. He's probably going to declare in the next 4 or 5 months, the Democrats will just get out of his way and say, like, you know, Joe Biden, like, you know, all the way. And then on the other side, Trump is going to draw probably between 10 and 15 opponents and the Republican primary. Now, the Republican primary advantages anyone who has a certain body of support. Trump only got 35% of the primary voters in 2016, but the other 7 candidates divided the other 65%, so he rolled. Even Trump right now is not thriving, but his base of support may never go below 35%. And so if the voting starts in Iowa and then New Hampshire and then on, and he gets 35%, he probably wins again if the other candidates all stay in. Now, if the candidates all sorted out amongst themselves, hey, we're just going to choose one of us, and then like that person's going to go against Trump, then Trump's chances of winning go down. But do you all think that's likely? You know, do you think the 10 other Republican candidates are going to look around and say, I guess it's you? No, they're each going to say, like, I think I'm it. And so, yeah, like, you could wind up with a Biden-Trump rematch in 2024. Combined age, 159. Now, in that circumstance, 58% of Americans don't want either of those choices. And so if you had a third-party candidate run in even as early as 2024, they probably start out with 20-25%, and then they either go up or down based upon whether they can compete. But almost 6 out of 10 Americans do not want either Biden or Trump, and they might get those options because of the dysfunction of the 2-party system. So when you ask, like, why do I think that this can work? It has to work, or else the alternatives are very bad. But I see that there's a path, depending upon frankly, a few individuals deciding to head in this direction. I mean, really, the American political system is not very healthy, but it hinges upon probably there are like 5 to 10 humans in America who could change things. It's pretty wild. I mean, again, it's an unhealthy system.
谢谢两位贵宾的提问。And now we already collected some questions, and these questions are about your campaign experience. So what major difficulties have you faced during your campaign, and what have motivated you to run for the president of the United States?
So deciding to run for president, it was like a lot of other things in my life where I thought it would be a certain way and then it was not. But then after you're in it, you're like, oh, like I'll adapt. And so the single biggest adjustment was that you become the product much more than you can ever imagine. Where I thought that I had some ideas and the ideas would be important and people would embrace the ideas, but that's not the way people work. And it's certainly not the way media works and politics in America works. What they need is they need a person to put everything on. And so being that person was a massive adjustment for me because I naturally don't enjoy necessarily being a public-facing figure or performing. I'm my father's son. Like, you know, my father is a PhD in physics with 69 U.S. patents. Like, I'm an introvert. You know what I mean? But I'm an introvert with a mission, and so then I thought, okay, what do I need to do to compete? And in order to compete, I needed to become a performer. So then I learned to perform, and that was a massive adjustment. Now the curve on that, I declared in 2018. And when did you all hear about my presidential campaign? 2019, let's say? So the first thing, thank you, by the way, I appreciate the heck out of you. Yeah, make America think harder, thank you, brother. So the first thing you thought when you heard about my campaign was this: please let him not be terrible. Right? You're like, what? Taiwanese American running for president? Oh, I hope he's not terrible. Now, there was like an adjustment between that point and then the, ooh, I really want him to do well. Like maybe I'll get my kids to donate or something like that. You know, like you didn't start out in the second camp. So that time period was about 12 months. So the 12 months of running to this question was me going around trying to get people to support me and getting a lot of people saying no, more or less. So that was the first 12 months, and then we gained momentum and energy and steam, and then the adjustment was standing in front of, as you saw from one of those pictures, thousands of Americans who actually put their hopes for the future in me. And that was a very different set of experiences, being recognized on the street. So if I go out in America without a mask, even with a mask sometimes, people will come up to me and say, hey, are you Andrew Yang? Say, yes, yes, I am. Like, oh, you know, really liked what you're about. Like that happens to me every single day in America if I go out in public. So there are a lot of things that I didn't anticipate, but now I have to take this set of experiences and learning and energy and try and transfer it towards productive solutions. So that's been my set of experiences over the last 5 years. The thing I'm most grateful for is that I'm still married, and my wife is, my mother-in-law is here, so thank you, Marilyn, for helping me stay married, because because it wasn't easy. And when I decided to go down this road, my parents were not excited about it. They were concerned. I think my mom sat me down and was like, hey, like, do you really want to do this? Like, they were concerned about my marriage, my family, my safety, various things. But then when I was running, I got a note or a call saying that my father was at a restaurant in Taiwan watching one of the presidential debates on CNN that I was in. And then he told the people in the restaurant, that's my son. And then they started cheering, and then they all bought him drinks. And so I thought about that arc from them sitting me down, trying to talk me out of it, to celebrating in that Taipei restaurant. And that's a very good feeling. So that's what the experience of running was like.
So how would you deal with the wrong democracy in the United States?
With the wrong democracy?
Yeah, wrong democracy, perhaps the inefficient.
Oh, yeah. So trying to reform the system has been like a different journey. I've had 3 different political journeys thus far. Running for president, running for mayor of New York City, and then starting the Forward Party. And each of them has been a very different journey. The Forward Party has been tremendous in that the people that are excited about the Forward Party are truly idealistic and selfless, because there's really nothing in it for them. You know what I mean? Like, if you get involved in Democratic or Republican Party politics, there may be something in it for you. Like, you might wind up connected to someone who's in power, or be able to call someone very influential, all of the trappings of politics. The Forward Party is for people who just want to save American democracy, make things better for our kids. So the people that are attracted to it are just extraordinarily noble and selfless souls. Now, in contrast, there are people who are on, on the side of the parties that will accuse you of various things, that will mischaracterize you, that will defame you in various ways. And in my case, because I came from the Democratic Party, I tend to get that more from the Democratic Party. After I left the Democratic Party, Fox News invited me to come on every single day, just to talk about how bad and dumb the Democratic Party is. Now, I turned all these invites down because that's not what I'm about. I'm not about playing the both sides thing or the one side versus the other. Now, if I had decided to embrace that, I could be, like making money from Fox and like the rest of it. I could be doing all sorts of things. But I left one side, said no to the other side to create my own new side. That's had some challenges associated with it.
So the next question is about the US and Taiwan relations. So some people say that Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. Do you agree with this phrase? And do you agree with the President Biden shift away from the strategic ambiguity towards clarity?
That's interesting. I thought ambiguity was good. I don't think Biden intended to do away with ambiguity. I think he's old, And then other people out there be like, hey. I mean, so that, I guess that's the second part of the question. The first part of the question?
People call the Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. So it means like Taiwan perhaps will be similar as Ukraine. The
Ukraine.
Yeah,
Ukraine. Got it. I understand that. I mean, everyone's very concerned that China will do something inadvisable where Taiwan is concerned. I think that a lot of Taiwanese Americans and Asian Americans were very anxious about seeing how Ukraine plays out, because if Russia had been rewarded for its aggressiveness, then people naturally would have thought that it would embolden China. Now, Russia has not been rewarded. So looking at, if there are any lessons to be drawn, they're hopefully going to have China come down on the side of reasonableness.
Welcome back to Taiwan.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Yeah, I don't know if you have heard of Mr. Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, one of the most prestigious journals in the U.S. And he said, Mr. Haass was appointed by President Bill Clinton to be the special envoy on the Northern Ireland problem in the 90s. And in his article, he said that the U.S. is moving in the direction of Northern Ireland, meaning U.S. will see more and more, quote-unquote, localized violence in the country. That, for a person of his stature and experience, I find it very disturbing. I don't know if you share this assessment. Thank you.
I do share his assessment, and it's borne out by the data. I mentioned earlier that there are over 300 militias in the U.S. There are something like a couple hundred deaths to political violence a year right now in the U.S. A civil conflict is defined as 1,000 civilian deaths a year due to political violence. I think that the odds of the United States surpassing that threshold are moderately high over the next 10 to 15 years, something along those lines. And some of those data points get underreported. But the people I know who are engaged in domestic terrorism investigations or anti-hate investigations say that all of their numbers are shooting up and to the right in terms of radicalization and hatred in the US. There are also 300 million firearms in the United States, approximately 1 for every man, woman, and child. So the country is an arsenal. And you have hundreds of thousands of young men in particular who are being radicalized and going down these internet rabbit holes, and they do not have a meaningful path forward. They're never going to get married. They don't have a good male role model. And so if someone gives them a sense of purpose and belonging that's extraordinarily misdirected, like many of them will take it. So America is being set up for a very, very negative time. The question is whether it will respond meaningfully, but the response would have to look very different than it currently does. And even if you were to do everything right in America, it would be a rough time. Let me say, like that. This stuff, as you can tell, it's been building up for 2 generations or so. Just the question is whether they will seize an opportunity to try and update and modernize various institutions and then get to solving the root problems. But even the data I showed on like marriages and families and whatnot, there's a guy named Richard Reeves who's a policy analyst from the Brookings Institute, which is very, very esteemed, right? Like by some accounts, the #1. So he wrote a book recently called Of Boys and Men, and it just set out the challenges for American boys and men in terms of their failings and failures. And he said to me, when I interviewed him, he said, a dozen people warned me not to write this book. Because if you talk about this, it goes against the prevailing political narrative. And he said that people warned him that he would be destroying his career, essentially. And he decided to do it anyway, in part because he's like, look, I'm essentially a tenured policy researcher at one of the foremost think tanks. So if I can't put this out there, then no one can. But the fact that he actually had to go through that gives you a sense of just how distressed America is. I imagine a lot of you probably have friends in academia because it's the family business for me. My father, uncle, grandfather, and brother are all professors. And they are all very, very scared in the American political environment where if they say the wrong thing in a class or have the wrong comment or whatnot, they're afraid their career will be destroyed. So there's a real unease that's being driven by this environment that's making solutions harder to come by.
So
does this make you feel better about Taiwan, everyone?
We still have a few minutes for one question. So we know you support universal basic income. So what do you think climate refugee identity for human beings and its relation to UBI?
Oh, wow. I really like that question. One of the things I was really proud of on my campaign was that I mainstreamed a conversation around cash relief in the US, where now dozens of US cities have cash relief pilots in various ways. They adopted something called the Enhanced Child Tax Credit that reduced poverty for 3 to 4 million American children. And then they stopped doing that at the beginning of this year, which broke my heart. That they lifted 3 or 4 million American kids out of poverty, and then they put them back in poverty at the beginning of this year because of our political dysfunction. But to the extent that we can help solve these problems in the States and in other countries. So my book, The War on Normal People, I've written, so this presentation you saw, in some ways is a very, very condensed version of 2 books I've written. One is The War on Normal People, which is about the transforming economy. And I was very proud that that book got translated into a dozen different languages and has spurred conversations around cash relief in other countries. With the hopes that maybe that can help diminish the number of climate refugees and others if that different countries end up adopting anti-poverty measures in various ways. Then the other book I wrote was called Forward, which is about the problems of American democracy and what I'm working on now with the Forward Party. So I still have ambitious goals for ways that we can alleviate poverty. I think that needs to happen in the US and other parts of the world. I now just think that the American political system needs to evolve in order for us to actually consider some of the bigger solutions. But I hope we can do so, and that will influence other countries.
And we got the last question, and a really important question. So can we donate to the Forward Party?
Wow, not a plant. Oh, you make me so happy. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for coming and for the support. You can 1,000% donate to the Forward Party at forwardparty.com with the big caveat that you need to be a US citizen or green card holder. But I know you know them. If that doesn't describe you, just you can talk to your friend who's, and here's another kicker, there is no donation limit. Because it's not a candidate, it's a political work. So you can donate as much as you want. Thank you for that question, not a plan. Wow, it makes me so happy. Warms my heart. Taiwan, touch your heart. Thank you all very, very much.